Well, at this time, I would like to invite our keynote speaker to the stage. It's wonderful to have Mr. Michael Shapcott with us here from the Wellesley Institute in Toronto. And so without any further ado, let's welcome Mr. Michael Shapcott.
And I think this is working. Sometimes I'm so used to not having a sound system and shouting that I'll try not to shout because I've put it the last 2 years. Thank you, Sharon, for your opening and for grounding us with that lovely image of joining hands. I was honored to be at the memorial just across the way earlier today, and I wanted to bring you news from Toronto. We have a homeless memorial as well, but I'm sad to say that rather than having it once a year, we have it every month. And we've been having it for a number of years now. We have almost 1,000 names of people who've died on the streets of Toronto in the last decade or so since we started our memorial. And I wanted to just bring the name of one person forward from those many names, because like you, we believe that there are two values to having a homeless memorial. One is to provide some measure of dignity to people whose lives were often deprived of not only the fundamentals of housing and food and good health, but also even basic respect and dignity. So we remember people by name. If you look at our list of the almost 1,000 people, you'll see that there's far too many John Does and Jane Does that are on our list because sadly there are literally at any given point several hundred people whose bodies are in the morgue who've been unidentified but found dead in the streets of Toronto. But I want to mention one woman, Jennifer Caldwell, who died on March the 6th of the year 2000. And so we remembered her in the year 2000. And we remembered her in a special way because in addition to our monthly gathering in downtown Toronto to remember Jennifer, some of the circumstances of her life and death were so important that we felt that we needed to take her memory slightly farther afield. Jennifer had come to Toronto from Winnipeg, and she'd come, like a lot of people come to Toronto, in order to get an education, to get a life. She was facing lots of great opportunity, but because of several circumstances, including some situations of violence, she ended up in a homeless encampment in a tent in one of our river valleys in downtown Toronto. And one night, on a fairly cold night, she had a little candle to keep herself warm, and the candle sadly caught the tent on fire, and she died quite a horrific death, of burning to death. And some of us have known Jennifer, and after we heard the news of her death, we went to the site of her encampment, and the police at this point had removed the body, but there were still the charred remains of her sleeping bag and the tent, and a diary in which she had written a lot of thoughts of her life, and we read the diary and were very moved by what we read. We decided to take some of the charred remains of the sleeping bag and go to Ottawa to the Prime Minister's office and to take these and to put them in the hands of whomever would receive them and point out that homelessness is not just an abstract issue, but it's issues for people like Jennifer and Art and many of the other people that are on our list. And we felt it was very important to do that. We constantly try to find ways in our homeless memorial, not simply just to remember and provide some measure of dignity to those that have died on our streets, but also to use it as a way to recommit ourselves to the struggle for safe and affordable housing. I wanted to also draw your attention, the opening slide here is a building that I kind of like in downtown Toronto, not because it's particularly interesting looking. It's an affordable housing building, one of the more recent ones, built about 4 or 5 years ago by the YWCA. It's called the Elm Center. They were having a sale on blue panels. I think a builder wanted to get rid of them. And so it's, you know, the building itself is not distinguished, but what is really interesting, if you notice in the front is this rather older building, which is a Victorian era building. It was actually built in 1850, 1851 in Toronto, and that was Toronto's original poorhouse. And back in the 1850s, if you were homeless in Toronto, people understood that homelessness, of course, was a result of individual sin. People were idle, they were given to sinful thoughts, and they became homeless. And so they were sent to the House of Industry, and they were put to work in the House of Industry because that was the cure for homelessness, was to get people focused on something useful. And what people did in the House of Industry in the 1850s and 1860s in Toronto, along with many other places, I'm not sure if Edmonton had one, I probably not at that era anyway. But what they would do in the Toronto House of Industry is they would take big rocks and they would take hammers and they would break the big rocks into little pieces of gravel. And when I first heard the story of the Toronto House of Industry, I thought to myself, was there like a shortage of gravel in Toronto? They needed to get people to do that? And of course the answer was no, there was no shortage of gravel in Toronto. But it was a meaningless, mindless thing, but people believed that that would occupy people's physical and mental abilities, that they would not sin, and they would eventually reform themselves from the sin of homelessness. Well, I'm happy to say that the Toronto House of Industry is now just a mere ghost. It's actually attached now to a modern building that's got about 300 units of housing. About 2/3 of the units of housing are for women. Half of them are for women who are fleeing from situations of violence. The other half are for mums and kids who have been homeless. And then on the other side, which you can't see, are 7 units that are set aside for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit and other Indigenous families. And then there's also some units set aside for women, Indigenous women who are homeless. And what this demonstrates are the two different approaches, two radically different approaches to how we understand homelessness. In the 1850s, homelessness was a sin. It was something, it was a character flaw of the individuals. It was part of their pathology, and they had to be put to work in meaningless tasks in order to focus their minds on, presumably, something positive. But now we understand, at least the smarter ones amongst us understand, that homelessness is actually, it's a deprivation, it's a lack of housing. And it's people who are facing barriers to housing and income. And I really like this building because I think it symbolizes that, in fact, as human beings, we can actually grow, we can learn. And as we're starting the reconciliation process after coming through a very searing truth-telling process, like you, Sharon, I'm proud to be a member of the Anglican Church, but I'm not proud of the history of our church, but I am proud of the fact that we are standing and apologizing, but there's a reconciliation process, and I like to think this building in some ways is a reconciliation for how we used to treat homeless people. Anyway, one of the things I do, I work for a research and policy institute, and I do spend a lot of time monitoring news. And I don't know if you guys, it was in your newspapers, but there was a provincial election in Alberta a little while back. Did you hear about the election? Yeah, it was big news in Toronto. And, you know, wow. All I can say is that, you know, we had a certain image of the people of Alberta, which you guys in the voting booth succeeded in changing that image of what Alberta was like. And I also take that as a hopeful note. I don't want to make, I see there's one member of the legislature here. I'm not being partisan. I'm strictly, ruthlessly non-partisan or multi-partisan. I'll talk to anybody who will talk to me, and I'll support anyone who will support sensible housing and homelessness programs. But what this says to me is that if in Alberta you guys can really change the dynamic and really, you know, reorient things in a way that really starts to shake things up. And when it comes to housing and homelessness, I think we can also do that, because that fundamentally is what we need to do. We need to start to change the conversation. So what I'm going to do now is So I mentioned I do get a lot of news stories that come from Toronto, from Ontario, from all across Canada, and from around the world. And this is just a few of them over the last few weeks. A report coming out of Winnipeg that women are among the biggest group among hidden homeless people in Winnipeg. In Nunavik, in northern Quebec, they're facing a 50% cut in their social housing, so their wait lists are getting longer and longer. In Timmins, a third of the people who are homeless are Indigenous people. In Toronto, just in the last day or so, new research showing that homeless people who go into hospital end up going back to hospital again very, very quickly, more quickly than people who are housed. In my hometown of Toronto, there are 168,584 people on our affordable housing wait list, which if you do the calculations, if we were to take all those people and put them in one area and call them a city, it'd be the 28th largest city in the country, which is astonishing. You've got a big wait list here. You've got, according to a figure I saw, 2,252 people counted as homeless in Edmonton. Just the other day in Maple Ridge, I was really interested to see an RCMP inspector saying about a homeless encampment in Maple Ridge that we cannot arrest our way out of homelessness. And a police officer saying criminalizing homelessness is not a way to end homelessness, which is interesting because too many municipalities are trying to criminalize homelessness. We have, just last week, two men who committed a horrific murder of a homeless man, put him on fire and killed him in the most gruesome possible way, convicted of murder, illustrating that homelessness, people who are homeless are victims of a whole range of violence. Some of it is vicious assaults, and some of it is the kind of violence that comes from lack of housing, lack of food, lack of income. Homeless encampments springing up in St. John's, Newfoundland. In Quebec, newcomers and singles are the hardest hit as the rental housing crisis gets worse there. When I look at that and I look at what's happening here in Winnipeg, here in Edmonton, whoops, we're going too fast here. When I look at what's happening here in Edmonton, but also when I look at Winnipeg, because I was just recently in Winnipeg and Ottawa and other places, three words come to mind that things are very familiar, that everything that I've said about all those different places, the high number of Indigenous people that are suffering from homelessness and the housing crisis, the fact that high rents and low incomes are combining to create a housing crisis for low, moderate, and even middle income people. This is very familiar. This is a nationwide issue. And I think we have to really keep saying that because we spend a lot of time in our own communities working on innovative issues, but we have to realize this is a nationwide issue. And because it's a nationwide issue, we actually need a nationwide solution and nationwide plans. It's also a complex issue. And that is to say there's not one magic solution. And again, I'm going to apologize to our new political friend because I recognize him sitting there, but I spend a lot of time with politicians, and one of the common things they say is, what's the one thing I can do to end homelessness? And I say, the one thing you can do is do everything, because there's not one thing, because there's not one homeless person. There's a range of homeless people and a range of needs and a range of supports and programs and housing that's needed. And in Canada, we actually are a smart country, and we're a country with lots of resources. And we can actually manage to do two or three things at one time, but we need to have a complex response and dynamic. Homelessness is not a static issue. The housing crisis is not static. It gets worse sometimes, it gets better at other times. But sometimes politicians will focus on a strategy of going out and counting the exact number of people who are homeless on the streets and say, okay, we'll come up with a plan to deal with those 3,227 people or whatever the number is that they count, not understanding there's a pipeline. We have a very robust pipeline which is generating more homelessness, and if we don't have prevention strategies to address the dynamic nature of homelessness, then we're in for a lot of problems. Everything is connected to everything else, and we need at the national level within the province of Alberta, here in Edmonton, and in communities across. We need better approaches that study, understand, and manage the complexity of homelessness. And we need to start thinking about systems of homelessness. Earlier, I was having a conversation with some folks from Homeward Trust. We were talking about the issue of women leaving situations of violence, and women who are actually named on a lease, and all of the systemic issues that flow from that. We have to understand the entire picture before we can actually begin to have an impact. I put a songbird here because it's hard for me to see people in the audience. I know that George Kelly is at the back there. Some of us who grew up in the 60s, maybe Jim will remember this too, but I remember as a young teenager in the 60s picking up a book by a woman named Rachel Carson, and it was called Silent Spring. And it was an amazing revelation to us in the 1960s because she was saying that the songbirds in northeastern United States and New England and the United States were going to die out. And one year there would be a spring with no songbirds. And she said the reason for that was because farmers were dumping DDT, a poisonous chemical, on their fields in the Midwestern United States. And people said, this is absolute lunacy. Because if you look at a map, the Midwestern United States is here and New England's way over there. How can it possibly be that dumping pesticides on a field here can affect birds over there? And that was the sort of response. And she wrote Silent Spring in order to explain to us that the natural world is actually an ecosystem. And over the years, we've begun to understand how wonderfully complex and connected everything is in the natural world. And with the exception of a few people, including, sadly, some people running for president of the United States, most people accept the idea that we live in a big, wonderful, natural world where everything is connected, and we have to take care of that because when we dump pesticides in the field here, it really does affect the songbirds elsewhere. We need to take that kind of thinking into our understanding of our social relationships, of housing and homelessness, that it is a complex system, and we need to understand how everything relates to everything else. Toronto Dominion Bank, one of Canada's biggest banks, they actually get the fact that homelessness and housing is not just about one thing, but it's actually a systemic issue. In 2003, they issued a report called Affordable Housing in Search of a New Paradigm. And they, in the year or two before this report was issued, the then Chief Executive Officer and President of Toronto Dominion Bank was making speeches all across Canada. At the time I was working for the University of Toronto in a research and policy institute there, and I used to, as I do now, monitor media. And I kept reading these speeches by this, the senior executive from Toronto Dominion Bank saying there's a housing crisis and everybody needs to get involved in the housing crisis. And I thought it's kind of weird because normally what you'd expect a bank executive to say is there's an affordable housing crisis and come to us at Toronto Dominion Bank and we'll give you a friendly service and a great rate on the mortgage. That's what you expect, and he wasn't saying that. I mean, I'm sure you did want people to come and get mortgages if they could afford it. So we eventually had we reached out and we had a meeting, and I have to tell you, it was rather unusual. So there was some community housing advocates on one side, and then some senior executives of Toronto Dominion Bank. We both agreed that we had to meet in a neutral location because the bank executives said if their fellow executives found out that they were meeting with community housing advocates, their reputation would be trashed. And we said if our colleagues find out we're meeting with the president of a bank, we won't be able to hold our heads high anymore either. So we agreed we'd meet privately, and they dressed down in blue jeans and we all put on suits because we thought that's how you dressed if it was a banker. It was really weird. Anyway, what came out of it was a commitment that the bank would put its economics department to solve the housing problem because bank economists are smarter than the rest of us. And they came out with a report, which is still quite a good report. The numbers are dated, but if you go online and Google TD Economics, affordable housing in search of a new paradigm, you'll find this interesting report. And it starts off by saying we're used to thinking of affordable housing as a social and health issue. In other words, people who have lack of affordable housing or people who are homeless, they have a heavier burden in terms of health, and they have a lot harder problem. And they go on to say, well, of course that's true. But they go on to say that affordable housing is also smart economic policy. An adequate supply of housing can be a major impediment to business investment and growth, can influence immigrants' choices of where to locate. Hence, implementing solutions to resolve this issue as well within the Toronto Dominion Bank's goal of raising Canadians' living standards and overall quality of life. So here's a bank saying that housing is not just about one thing or another, it's actually about a number of issues. It's about employment, it's about ensuring that the economy remains robust, and it's also about health and social issues. So we really do have to have that broad understanding of housing. Now, I don't know if Charles made his way into the Edmonton Journal or the media here, but he got a huge amount of media attention in the United States about 3 weeks ago. So Charles works in the U.S. Senate, which is the building right behind here. He cleans the toilets in the U.S. Senate, which I guess is a pretty important job. I mean, these are the most powerful politicians in the world, and I presume they want to have nice toilets when they need to use them. So it's an important job, and he works full-time, and he's very diligent. He's a good worker. At night, he would go to the local metro station, the subway station, and sleep on the platform of the subway station because he wasn't making enough money as a full-time cleaner working for the U.S. government to actually be able to afford to rent a place in Washington, D.C. And when this news came out, it was like a bombshell that for some reason people hadn't made the connection between the fact that income is very much related to housing issues. And when a face like Charles's face came on this, and when we actually found in the, when it was discovered that right in the very heart of the American government, at the very pinnacle of American power, is a man who's working hard, doing everything that you're supposed to do, which is get in there, do a good job, clean your toilets, make them spotless and shiny for the senators and their staff and guests and so on, and he was doing that, and he didn't have a place to live. Challenge to the Alberta legislature: how much are you paying your people to clean your legislature, and is that enough for them to afford housing? So because I do work for a Research and Policy Institute, because we're in a library, I want to show you a couple of charts, because this is the intellectual quotient of this. Don't fall asleep though, because this is really interesting stuff.
No problem.
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is the club of the richest nations in the world. It's currently got 32 members, and the United States, Canada, all the big European countries, et cetera, So all of the countries which call themselves the most advanced economies of the world, they're all part of the OECD. So the OECD, again, it's the club of the richest nations in the world. Sometimes the Research and Policy Institute that I work for, because we care about things like homelessness and housing and so on, they call us a left-leaning research institute, because who else cares about housing and homelessness but a left-leaning institute? You'd never call the OECD left-leaning. It is the voice of the leading economies of the world. In September of 2008, the OECD put out a very, very interesting report called Growing Unequal. And I just want to stop for a second and repeat, it was September of 2008. I don't know if anyone has a good memory. Does anyone know what happened on September of 2008, roughly?
Crash.
Yeah, the whole global economy collapsed because the Americans, starting with President Clinton and then President Bush, had thought that they could get every single person in the United States to become a homeowner, and that would solve their housing problem. And they created an instrument, Wall Street created an instrument called the Ninja Mortgage, no income, no asset. And it not only succeeded in collapsing the American economy, but it collapsed the entire global economy. So sadly, this report, which is one of the most important reports that's come out of the OECD in a long time, got no attention because everyone was focused on the poor banks and the troubles they were facing. But for Canada, this is what the OECD reported. These bars show poverty in Canada. So this is starting in the mid-1970s, and it goes basically 10 years and then 5 years after that. So what you see is from the mid-1970s, so basically 75 to 1990, poverty is going way down, right to 1995. In fact, we cut poverty in Canada by 50% over that 20-year period. And we did that not because we set up a whole bunch of houses of industry and put people to work breaking big rocks into little rocks. We did that because we had a national housing program from 1973 to 1993, which delivered 600,000 good quality social housing homes here in Edmonton and everywhere else in Canada. We brought in seniors income support programs so that seniors, especially senior women who at the time were facing some of the worst poverty burdens, actually had money in their pockets and could afford to pay their heating bills and their food bills and so on. We had a national income assistance program called Canada Assistance Plan, which was cancelled in 1995, the year that we stopped our amazing progress in terms of eradicating poverty. The Canada Assistance Plan said that provinces setting up their income support systems like welfare should try to make sure the systems actually reflect the real cost of housing, food, and other basic things, which is it wasn't a perfect thing, but it was good, and at least set a goal saying, look, welfare should have some relationship, broadly speaking, to what people actually have to pay to live a decent life. In February of 1995, the Canada Assistance Plan and the federal budget of 1995 was cancelled. National Housing Program, all new funding cancelled in 1993, and the National Housing Program starting in 1996. The federal budget of 1996 was gradually eroded. So Canada, which made tremendous progress, we were on track to really we were down below, we were at 9% in terms of poverty in Canada, and we were on a downward trajectory, and if we'd stuck to that trajectory, but our politicians made some different choices, especially at the national level. They cancelled the Canada Assistance Plan in February of 1995. In June of 1995, in my home province of Ontario, perhaps you've heard of it, in that year we had a rather stunning election as well, and it resulted in the election of a premier named Mike Harris. And within 1 month, Mike Harris said, we're going to cut welfare by 21.8% because we believe that people on welfare need an incentive to go out and get a job, and there's nothing more incentivizing than starving people to death. And when people said, how can people, when they get a 21.8% cut in their welfare, pay their landlord? And the premier said, well, they can go negotiate a lower rent with their landlord. That's a good idea. How can they afford to put food on their table? Dave Tabucci, the welfare minister, said, go to the local grocery store, look for a dented tin of tuna, negotiate. Politicians made choices, and they made choices based on trends that were beginning to happen. And what happened when politicians made choices? Poverty started to go back up again. So by the mid-2000s, in Canada, we started to see poverty rising again. And the OECD, in commenting on Canada, said after 20 years of continuous decline, so we were doing great, both inequality and poverty rates have increased rapidly in the past 10 years, now reaching levels above the OECD average. So in other words, at this point in the mid-1990s, when we were at our peak, we were actually beating the pants off of every other country. We had international bragging rights. And I'm not the kind of person who, like most Canadians, we don't stand up and sort of say, yay Canada. We're kind of modest. But there are certain things we should be proud of, and one of them is the achievements we achieved in those 2 decades, which have all been reversed. Now, this was issued in September of 2008, and it got buried in the other news. So about 3 years later, they issued a follow-up report, and the follow-up report sadly just confirms that the choices that politicians made have had real consequences.